Chicago, 1893. A city of blinding white light and impenetrable black shadows. On one side of town, the world's greatest architects were building a white city of plaster and gold. A dream of neoclassical perfection meant to showcase the peak of human civilization. But just a few miles away, in a soot-stained corner of Englewood, a charming man with piercing blue eyes was building a very different kind of monument. It was a building of secret passages, airtight vaults, and acid vats, while the world looked toward the future. At the world's Columbian Exposition, the devil himself had taken up residence in a castle of horrors. This is not just a story of a fair. It is the true chronicle of how America's first urban serial killer turned the greatest show on earth into his private hunting ground. The architect of ambition in the late 1880s, Chicago was a city of smoke, blood, and mud. It was the hog butcher for the world, a place where the stench of the Union stockyards hung heavy in the air like a physical weight, a metallic tang of blood and manure that defined the city's industrial soul. Into this cacophony stepped a man who called himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. He was handsome, dapper, and possessed a voice that sounded like silk sliding over glass. To the residents of Englewood, he was a successful pharmacist, a charming newcomer who had saved an elderly woman's drugstore business only for the woman to mysteriously move to California and never be heard from again. Beneath the expensive wool suits and the perfectly waxed mustache lived Herman Webster Mugget. Since his childhood in the rural woods of New Hampshire, Herman had been fascinated by the anatomy of death. While other children played, he performed crude surgeries on forest animals. He wasn't just interested in how things lived, he was obsessed with how they ceased to be. Holmes didn't just want money, he wanted a kingdom. He purchased a lot across from the drugstore and began constructing a 3-story, block-long building. The locals called it the Castle. To the outside observer, it was a grand hotel intended to house the millions of visitors expected for the upcoming World's Fair. To Holmes, it was a precision-engineered machine designed for the efficient disposal of human life. The White City rises while Holmes laid his bricks in Englewood. A group of men led by Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted were attempting the impossible. They had been tasked with building a city from scratch, a white city that would rival Paris and prove that Chicago was more than just a slaughterhouse. The challenges were The chosen site, Jackson Park, was a swampy mess of sand and brackish water. The deadlines were suicidal, but Burnham, driven by the motto, make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood, gathered the greatest minds of the Gilded Age. They created the first Ferris wheel, massive 264-foot structure meant to outshine the Eiffel Tower. They illuminated the night with millions of Edison light bulbs, a sight so dazzling that visitors wept at the sheer beauty of the electric city. They built palaces of staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris and hemp fiber that looked like solid marble but glowed like a dream under the prairie sun. The fair was a beacon of hope. It was the birth of the modern world. It gave us the Pledge of Allegiance, the first taste of Cracker Jack, and the promise of an American century. But for every 1,000 people who stepped off the trains to see the Midway, 1 or 2 would find their way to the quiet, dark corner of 63rd and Wallace, seeking a cheaper room and a friendly face. The blueprint of Nightmares the Castle was a labyrinth of madness. During its construction, Holmes frequently fired his contractors, accusing them of shoddy work and refusing to pay. In reality, he was ensuring that no single person knew the full layout of the building. Only he possessed the master map of the horror he was creating. The second floor was the heart of the maze. There were rooms with no windows, lined with asbestos to stifle any screams. Doors opened into solid brick walls, and stairs ended abruptly at the ceiling. There were blind rooms where gas lines had been installed, controlled from a master valve in Holmes's private bedroom. He could suffocate his guests with the flick of a wrist while they slept. Dreaming of the wonders they had seen at the fair, the basement was the most terrifying of all. Hidden behind a false wall, it contained a keel capable of reaching temperatures high enough to cremate a human body in hours. There were vats of corrosive acid quicklime pits and a dissecting table where Holmes used his surgical skills to strip the flesh from his victims' bones. He wasn't just a killer. He was an entrepreneur. He would often article the skeletons and sell them to medical schools, profiting from the same person twice. The Vanishing and The New Woman. The victims were mostly young women, the new women of the 1890s. They were independent, moving to the cities for jobs as stenographers and clerks, seeking the freedom the Gilded Age promised. They were vulnerable, often disconnected from their families, and easily charmed by the doctor with the soft voice and the piercing blue eyes. There was Julia Connor, a strikingly beautiful woman who worked in the castle's pharmacy. She believed Holmes was the man of her dreams. She disappeared along with her young daughter, Pearl, on Christmas Eve. Holmes told neighbors they had gone away for a medical procedure. Then there was Emmeline Seagrans, a stenographer from Indiana. She believed she was going to marry the doctor. Instead, she was led into a soundproof vault. As the air ran out and the gas seeped in, she left a single, desperate footprint on the inside of the metal door. Mark discovered years later when the police finally raided the building. As the fair reached its crescendo in the summer of 1893, Chicago was a sea of anonymous faces. In a city of millions, a disappearance was easy to overlook. The police were overwhelmed, and Holmes was a master of the paper trail, forging letters from the missing to their families, claiming they had found love or fortune in distant states. The shadow collapses. The fair ended in October 1893, not with a celebration, but with a tragedy. The beloved mayor of Chicago, Carter Harrison, was assassinated by a disgruntled official. The lights of the White City were extinguished, and the magical buildings began to crumble. Within months, many of them caught fire, their plaster walls burning like dry paper. Holmes, too, felt the walls closing in. The insurance companies were becoming suspicious of his many claims, and the creditors were at his door. He set fire to the top floor of the castle for the insurance money. But the adjusters saw through the fraud. He fled Chicago, beginning a frantic cross-country odyssey. He took with him Benjamin Patel, his creature and business associate. Patel was a man of weak will and many children, whom Holmes used as pawns in a final, elaborate insurance scam. In Philadelphia, Holmes murdered Patel, claiming it was a life insurance simulation gone wrong. He then took 3 of Patel's children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, on a horrific journey through the Midwest. telling them their father was hiding in London, while he systematically led them to their deaths. The great detective and the unraveling of H. Holmes fell to Detective Frank Geyer of the Philadelphia Police Department. Geyer was a man of immense patience and a father himself. He tracked Holmes's movements through hotel registries and train schedules, retracing the path Holmes took with the Petessel children. In Toronto, the search became a race against time. Geyer interviewed a neighbor who remembered seeing a tall, handsome gentleman digging a large hole in a cellar. When Geyer entered that cellar and began to dig, he found the remains of Alice and Nellie Petessel buried in their NIGHTGOWNS in Indianapolis. He found the remains of young Howard inside a large stove. The discovery broke Geyer's heart but solidified the case. The gilded shadow could no longer hide behind his charm. The evidence was no longer just paper and fraud. It was the bones of children. The trial of the Archvine's trial in 1895 was a media circus, the likes of which America had never seen. The yellow press competed for the most gruesome headlines. Holmes sat in the courtroom, composed and arrogant. He frequently corrected the prosecution on minor details, seemingly more offended by a slight against his intelligence than the accusation of mass murder. The most damning moment came when the castle in Chicago was finally explored by the police. They found the secret passages, the bone fragments in the kill, and the jewelry of the missing women. The Bluebeard of Chicago was exposed. Holmes attempted one final performance. He sold a confession to the newspapers for thousands of dollars, claiming he had killed 27 people. He described his crimes with a chilling lack of remorse, claiming that his very features were changing to resemble the devil. He wanted to be remembered as a supernatural force of evil, a dark god of the Gilded Age. The final descent. On May 7th, 1896, the end came for H. Holmes. He was led to the gallows at Moyamensing Prison. To the very end, he maintained a mask of calm, even joking with the guards about the thickness of the rope. His final request was a testament to his paranoia and his narcissism. He asked to be buried in a double-thick coffin filled with wet concrete, which would then be encased in more concrete. He was terrified that his own body would be stolen by grave robber Z, very thing he had done to others at the start of his career. The trapdoor fell at 10:12 a.m. Due to a malfunction in the mechanism. He did not die instantly. He spent 15 minutes strangling at the end of the rope, his body twitching in the morning light while the witnesses looked on in a silence that felt like a long overdue prayer. Chapter 9. The Ghost of the Midway World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 changed the world. It gave us the modern city, the skyscraper, and the dream of a technological utopia. But it also birthed the modern serial killer. H. Holmes was the byproduct of the urban explosion, a man who thrived in the anonymity of the crowd and the isolation of the big city. He was the dark reflection of the white city's grandeur. Today, the site of the murder castle is occupied by a nondescript post office. No plaques commemorate the victims who walked through those doors with hope in their hearts. But the story of the Gilded Shadow remains a permanent stain on the history of Chicago, reminding us that even in the brightest cities, there are corners where the light can never reach. The legend of H. Holmes remains a cornerstone of American Gothic history, a reminder of the duality of the human spirit during the rise of the American century.